Thanks for everyone's attendance. We're excited to talk to you today about network penetration testing. Our presenter will be Chad Horton, who is a CISSP, a QSA, and the Senior Director of our penetration testing team here at SecurityMetrics. Chad has been here at SecurityMetrics for 11 years, and he was actually on the penetration test guidance special interest group for the PCI Security Standards Council. So he was part of the group that helped define the penetration test standards and the updates that recently came out. So a wealth of knowledge, lots of experience, and hopefully you can learn a lot from him today. So at this point, we'll get into the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Chad, and he's going to cover, kind of the objective as well as the agenda to what the webinar will cover today. Go ahead, Chad.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So today we really want to, we're trying to help the audience understand the basics of network penetration testing. Oftentimes this is a hurdle that organizations that we work with have in regards to they get told they need to get a penetration test done, but they don't understand what it is, and they don't know how to speak intelligently with management or other pen test providers to evaluate what's being done or what they're paying for. And so really what we're trying to do is ultimately educate our audience on what a network penetration testing is. So today we're going to start off by talking about basics of network penetration tests. This is, again, a 101 presentation, so we're going to be focusing mainly around basics, but we'll just do a brief overview of network penetration testing. We'll talk about how they're performed, and then we'll go into some best practices and just general recommendations that will help you be prepared to enter the world of penetration testing or to talk about penetration testing. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So pretty straightforward, network penetration test is an assessment that focuses on the design, implementation, and maintenance of a network and the services hosted on it. So let's translate that to something meaningful. So a network penetration test is going to help identify misconfigured software, firewalls, or operating systems, outdated software and operating systems, insecure protocols, unnecessary exposures, things of that nature. These are the categories of security issues that a network assessment is really going to focus on. It's important to note that this software or the security issues that we're identifying here is in software that was not written by the organization. So a few years back, around 2007, the PCI industry introduced this concept of a network pen test and an application pen test. And it's sort of cross industries by this point. And so oftentimes there's confusion between the two. So we want to talk about what's the difference between a network pen test and an application pen test. An application pen test is going to focus on the security of custom code and the supporting software, while a network pen test is going to focus on software that wasn't written for the organization. We're talking about Microsoft, Apache, Linux. We're talking about software that's generic and available for all users to be used. So if you were to sort of compare the two directly, this is how I would boil it down. A network pen test is going to focus on the network services on a given IP, host, or network, while an application is going to focus on coding flaws that introduce vulnerabilities into an application they've written. A network pen test, to fix issues from it, you're going to install a patch, reconfigure the software, or remove a legacy protocol. On application pen tests, you're going to have to recode the application. You're going to have to either get your developers or hire a developer to come and fix the issue inside of the actual code itself. So why get a network pen test? This answer is very similar to the answer we gave during the application webinar. Ultimately, organizations are trying to hire IT professionals to build their environments, to build a network, to maintain their wireless networks, to provide support to their end users' workstations. These IT professionals are not security experts. That's typically not a requirement on the job posting or the job description. So a network pen test can help tailor them or assist them in their efforts to provide these services in a secure manner. It also helps you avoid compromise and loss of sensitive data, but most likely you're probably looking for a pen test for a compliance standard, either PCI, DSS, HIPAA, or some other standard that's driving you to become compliant. So what should be tested is the perimeter of the environment that stores sensitive information, while the concept of store, process, and transmit is a PCI terminology or PCI phrase. It can be applied to any standard. Anything that is storing, processing, or transmitting personal identifiable information, PHI, PII, could be applied to the same definition, and a good way to approach security in general. While this definition is definitely not foolproof, it's a great place to start if you're looking to start a security program within your organization. In addition to just testing the perimeter, though, it's important to identify this concept of critical systems. In the PCI realm, we've put up the definition there, but they've introduced this, and we've seen a huge improvement in our customers' security as a result of it. Ultimately, what we're looking at is services that support the servers that store, process, and transmit data. So we're talking about domain name servers, DNS, we're talking about domain controllers, we're talking about JavaScript libraries, things of that nature. Anything that provides support to the CDE or a secure server that if compromised, it could affect the security of it, you would want to include that in a pen test. So we're going to look at a quick topographical view of a network. And this is targeting mainly a PCI realm, but again, these principles could be applied anywhere. In the top right corner here, we have the CDE, or this is the servers that store, process, and transmit the data that we're interested in securing. So we've isolated it up to that top right corner. On the top left corner, we have a shared services. These are servers that are providing support for our secure environment. Directory services is up there. We've got a logging server. And we've also got an admin workstation, which is allowed to connect into the CDE and manage those servers. In the bottom, we've got a corporate LAN where all the employee devices are. And the nature of having our directory services, our domain controller up there, is that the corporate LAN is also able to dial into that shared services zone. However, the corporate LAN is not able to access our cardholder data environment or our secure zone. In this situation, the network penetration test would need to target two different perspectives. From the shared services environment, we would want to attack all the exposures into the CDE. So from shared services to CDE, we would want to perform a pen test. And also from the corporate LAN, we would want to do an assessment into the shared services zone. The theory of that second part is that if an employee device compromised the domain services, the directory services, could they then pivot and access the CDE, or could they then escalate their privileges in a manner that ultimately allows them to compromise sensitive data? So those are the two network penetration tests that would need to be performed here. For those of you who participated in our segmentation check webinar that we did last December, from the corporate LAN to the CDE, we would also perform a seg check from there just to verify that, hey, that network is not supposed to hit the secure zone. Let's verify that they're not able to. So when we talk about perimeters, there are two perimeters that we're typically looking for. The external perimeter, or the part of your network that's exposed to the internet, and the internal perimeter. In that previous slide, we just went over the internal perimeter. That's the equivalent of coming from the shared services zone into the CDE, and also from the corporate zone into the shared network zone. So those are the two perimeters that we would be testing there. So when should pen testing be performed? So if you're in the PCI realm, they recommend after any major network change or annually. And this is sort of self-evident. You perform the annual assessment to verify that you're maintaining a security posture at a level that you feel comfortable with. And then when you change your network layout or architecture, you want to make sure that those changes haven't lowered that security level, that you're not exposing anything additional. And so we typically recommend that guidance as well, even if you're not in the PCI realm. So for HIPAA, for banking industries that we've dealt with, we recommend the same guideline. So we're going to go ahead and pause for a minute and see if there are any questions that have come in, and then we'll continue on with the rest of the webinar.
So you want me to just kind
Okay, great. So we've gotten some good questions. So one is, does PCI require only the network level or penetration tests, or also application penetration testing?
Great question. So they require 3 types of pen testing: network layer pen testing, application pen testing, and segmentation checks. So this is the third of those that we're covering, and we're just wrapping that up. So they require all 3 of those.
Great. And what would you define as a major network change as far as needing a penetration test outside of the regular schedule?
Yeah, so the types that we typically run into are restaurant chains when they're introducing a new store or a new series of stores that are going to be using a new technology. Maybe you're switching from a Brocade firewall over to Cisco or vice versa. You want to make sure that that change, those rules, get properly ported accurately. Also, when we see people change technologies, we're going from a OpenVPN or an SSL VPN tunnel over to IPsec, and we want to make sure that we've done that in a secure manner. Or if you're introducing new network zones, you created a new department, and you want to make sure that that department has the correct access to all the other zones, and that it doesn't introduce new risk to the organization.
Great. And we've received variations of similar questions, so hopefully we answer yours as we kind of try to combine some of these questions. So as far as the annual penetration testing, would you say best practice would be to do it more often, and annual is just the PCI requirement? What would kind of be your view on whether it's for PCI, general data security, maybe even for HIPAA or another mandate as far as scheduling them?
Great question. So me personally, I view the annual as what you would want to do for the network, application, and seg checks, aka you're doing it from an external or an internal perspective of a compromised machine. However, there are different types of assessments that could also be considered, that could be performed, and I would recommend performed at different times during the year. Social engineering is a common one that people aren't educated on, and it can be a direct attack vector into the cardholder data environment. Wireless penetration testing, not technically required by the PCI DSS or some of these other standards, is another one you could consider. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend increasing the frequency. I would recommend exploring different types of penetration tests. One that we actually got introduced to about 2 years ago, which is actually a very fun one to perform, is we'll have organizations give us the laptop of an employee that recently got terminated, and they'll give us their authentication tokens, either terminated or left the company, but they'll give us their authentication credentials and ask us, what could this employee have done to our internal network? They don't suspect the employee of anything. They're just curious of knowing what would a rogue employee be able to perform or do against their network. So there are different types of penetration tests that I would explore rather than just increasing the frequency of the penetration test.
Great. And one, again, that we've received a few different questions similar to this, is a penetration test defined as automated, manual, a combination? Does it need to be manual to be considered a penetration test?
You know, we're actually going to put a lot of effort on answering that question here in a few slides, so I'm going to postpone that one till the end. And after I've covered that topic, if there are any additional questions, feel free to send them back in and we'll answer them.
Perfect. So we do have a handful of other questions. At the end of the webinar, we're going to try to get to as many as possible. If we aren't able to get to your question today because we have had so many come in, we will reach out on an individual basis to make sure that everyone feels like their questions were answered, and we can dive into more specifics to your situation.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on. So let's talk about performing a network penetration test. So the objective, again, is to identify and exploit issues that could allow an attacker to access systems or resources that they should not be able to. So examples that we commonly provide to people is, have you updated to the latest patch to fix the latest 0-day? We are all intimately familiar with Heartbleed and numerous other vulnerabilities that were covered by the mass media, and so this is a common one that we're looking for, is, are you up to date in patching correctly? Have services been properly configured to prevent insecure configurations? A lot of emphasis is placed on removing default credentials or default configurations, but companies are often surprised when they find out that their configuration above and beyond the default can introduce issues. They're often surprised by that. So how they choose to configure it can expose issues. So we want to make sure that you're using that software in a secure manner. And last but not least, are you using insecure protocols, things of that nature, or services in general? So before we dive in too deep, let me just do this call out real quick. This is a common problem in any type of penetration test, but especially with network layers. The most common issue that we encounter while performing these is that many modern firewalls have a configuration option enabled that by default will attempt to inhibit the ability of port scanning to identify available services. It does this by returning responses or packets that are usually restricted for left for ports that are open, but the firewall will just report that on all ports. While the intent is a noble one to try and thwart attackers, this mainly inhibits penetration testers and other white hat hackers that are trying to help the organization, not necessarily impacting the attackers in the way that they believe it is. From my perspective, attackers have a much longer time frame in which to retrieve their information. So once this behavior is identified, there are many strategies that they can sort of deploy to bypass this layer of protection. It's also important when engaging a penetration test provider to ensure that any options that could inhibit the analyst's ability to assess the environment to be disabled. Not doing so will simply water down the results obtained by the analyst, directly costing the organization money and a lost opportunity. The second most common issue we face is with intrusion protection systems. Similar to what we just described with firewalls and that configuration option, many firewalls have IPS software or functionality built into them. However, with an IPS, it's not a black or white. It's not turn it on or turn it off. You usually have the ability to whitelist a given analyst IP address, essentially telling the firewall or the IPS software not to block that traffic, even though it may look malicious. This is very important because it'll improve the accuracy of the results that you're going to get back from a penetration test. So penetration testing tools, I can't really, in the limited time that we have here, I couldn't provide a comprehensive list. So I just provided some of my go-to scanners that I use. During a penetration test, there's the host discovery and port scanning phase, so Nmap is my go-to. There are plenty of other ones out there. If you just simply Google them, you'll be able to find them. During a pen test, when I come across a specific port or service I'm not familiar with, we'll talk about this in a minute. One of my go-tos is to look for service-specific scanners. There are also general-purpose VA scanners, where we should all be familiar with these, like Nessus and OpenVAST. They basically scan a wide array of services and can identify a myriad of vulnerabilities or configuration issues associated with them. Last but not least, exploitation tools. Metasploit is by far the most popular in the industry, but similarly there are other alternatives available as well. So let's talk about the stages of a manual testing. So one of the questions asked just barely was about the difference between an automated and a manual pen test. I'm not going to cover that in super detail here because we'll cover that towards the end, but I'm going to mention that there are different levels of a penetration test here and sort of how they differ. So we have 5 steps typically associated with our assessments. We do a high-level overview after the automated scans have completed. Let's look at what does the environment look like. This is the equivalent of like a 10,000-foot view looking down so that you get familiar with what you're going to be assessing. The second step we do is validate the automated scan results. We're wanting to make sure that the IPS didn't block us, that the scan results that were found were actually accurate, things of that nature. We're going to identify issues, we're going to step into exploitation, and then we're going to document our findings. So an automated only pen test typically just performs the automated scans. There are other views, or a different type, I call it the semi-manual, or the automated assisted penetration test, where they will ultimately perform down to bullet point 2 there. They'll just validate the automated scans. This is the equivalent of roughly signing up with an ASV, an automated scan vendor through PCI, and having them scan your network and then calling their tech support and asking them to verify the findings that were there. While they can call that a penetration test by their standards, I personally don't find that to be a penetration test. So again, as we talk about that high-level overview, you're really just trying to understand the environment that's to be tested. Am I dealing with a Microsoft shop, people who deploy mainly Microsoft services, or am I dealing with an open source Linux, Apache, LAMP stack? This helps me target my efforts towards the technologies that are being involved in the given environment. I'm going to validate the automated results by looking for indications of scan interference. It's surprising how frequently we run into scan interference, and then I want to eliminate false positives when there are results. I want to make sure that I don't pass those on to the customer, because as a penetration tester, I only want to provide my customer actionable items, and false positives can ultimately lead to a time drain and don't provide the service that we want to give our customers. Next, we want to identify issues. Is the protocol secure? On a given service, is the service well maintained? What are the recommended steps for securing the service? Once I know a lot about that service, these questions, I'm then going to apply that to the service I'm looking at. This often includes a lot of research. We're spending time in manuals for the given technology. We're spending time on forums associated with the technology to look for common issues or common misconfiguration trends. And last but not least, I'm going to spend a lot of time within the security industry and see if I can find any service-specific scanners or scripts that could assist in both identifying and exploiting the issues. And then once I identify a vulnerability, we're going to step in and try and identify what is the actual impact of the issue. Once I get access to a server, I'm going to then see what can I use that new access, how can I move within their environment from there. If I get access onto a web server, can I now start hitting the other web servers within that environment? Can I then pivot and further my attacks beyond what I already have? So it's important to note, though, that if a environment is relatively clean, that there may not be any issues to exploit. This is common in PCI realm because people focus very heavily on segmenting out their CDE or cardholder data environment from their other servers to descope them. And so we're only targeting these really hardened services. So it is common to see that you'll get a clean pen test report or a cleaner pen test report that didn't have a lot of exploitation on it. For organizations that decide to go above and beyond, rather than just targeting what's prescribed on the scope and they target everything, you're going to see a lot more exploitation on your reports and a lot more findings and recommendations on how to improve. Last but not least, and often underappreciated, is the need for documentation. In the penetration test supplement, which we'll also include a link to at the end of this presentation, we went over 5 basic things that should be included in a penetration test report. They seem very self-evident from a security perspective: a description of the issue, what's affected by it, how could an exploit affect the organization, what risk would they apply it, and then references to industry standard bodies like CVEs, bids, things of that nature. However, it's alarming to me when I receive, on a daily basis almost, pen test reports from other vendors or internal pen tests where they haven't even provided the targets that were affected by the issue. And the organization that received the pen test report is left in a situation to try and determine what's affected. How do I remediate this? If you're coming away from a pen test with those questions, I would assert that the pen tester has failed to properly document their findings. So we're going to do another quick break here while we go over any questions that came over on that last section. So I'll pass it back over.
Great. So can you just revisit the 3 different types of penetration tests for PCI and maybe just give, again, just a quick summary of each of them?
Yes, definitely. And in fact, just to let you know, that's on our roadmap for a follow-up webinar that we'll be doing next, which is, now that we've gone over all 3 of these, let's give a high-level overview of the landscape, and we want to talk a little bit more in general terms. So, but just to do a quick overview, A segmentation check occurs when you have an environment, say like a guest wireless network, that should not have access to another network. If I walk into Starbucks doesn't want me to connect to their wireless and be able to hit their internal database servers. So a segmentation check is the equivalent of stepping onto that network and trying to gain access or hit that other environment. So you're verifying that segmentation is in place and effective. In application pen test, people most commonly associate this with web applications. We're going to be hitting that web application and looking for coding flaws in there. If you've heard the term, the buzzwords, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, privilege escalation, all of these things are typically associated with a web application assessment that is performed. But the application doesn't have to be a web application, could be a web API, or it could be a custom protocol, a custom application that they've written. And last but not least is the network pen test, what we're talking about here today. This is more of a general purpose pen test where you're targeting the network services exposed on a network. So SSH, RDP, FTP, I can actually say those. So secure shell, remote desktop protocol, file transfer protocol. We're targeting all of the use of these different services, and we want to validate that you're securely implementing those, maintaining them, and using them on a day-to-day basis.
Great. And really quick, before I ask a few more questions to Chad, we've had multiple questions come in. We will be sending out a recording of the webinar, and it'll include these question sections that we've done in the middle. So we'll send that out in the next few days, and we'll include the slide deck as well for your review. You can share the slide deck, the recording, with people internally or externally in your organization that might be interested in understanding it better. And when we send out the recording, we'll also include, as Chad mentioned, and as a few people have asked about, the link to our other two recordings where we discussed segmentation checks and web application penetration testing. We'll also include a link to the supplement that Chad referenced that can probably give you a lot of answers as well when it comes to penetration test guidance in the PCI realm. We'll ask one or two more questions and keep going to make sure we can get everything covered. Do you have any general tips for defining the scope of a network pen test for PCI? Or where should they start when trying to understand what the scope is?
Yes. So one of the requirements inside of the PCI DSS is that you need to maintain a list of all the hosts that are in the CDE. And so what I recommend is first off creating that inventory, because once you have that inventory of these hosts, either store, process, or transmit cardholder data, in PCI realm, that ultimately expands to the network. And so that ultimately says if I have a web server in a network with 100 other web servers that don't touch it, all 101 web servers are in scope. So that entire network's in scope. So that allows you now to take it from the hosts to the networks that are in scope. Once you have that inventory of networks that are in scope, you want to create an inventory, the inverse of it, of anything that is not in scope for PCI. And then ultimately it's just a matter of drawing the lines between the two. Can I target, does network A, which is out of scope, does it have access into a network B? Oftentimes this is like internal wikis or logging or domain controllers, things of that nature. They have access into it. There's also the element of critical systems, which we briefly touched upon, where you want to identify services that may not, or web servers that may not, servers that may not touch cardholder data, but they impact the security of it. If the domain controller is shared across both the CDE and non-CDE, you want to make sure that you're testing against that as well. So that's how I would recommend approaching it. Start with inventories of hosts, move to inventories of networks, and from there define the perimeter around it, the CDE, and then identify avenues into it, and that's your network pen test.
Great. And we'll ask one last question before Chad continues on, and just to give the caveat that obviously these things change depending on your organization, your scope. But Chad, can you give just a general feel for how long a penetration test typically takes, how long that project would take?
Yeah. That's one of those where it's a difficult one to answer because there isn't a one pill fits all or solves all. It really depends on the number of hosts within the environment and the number of services that are exposed. The average level 4 merchant that we run into is typically looking around 2 to 3 days for a network pen test. But when we're dealing with level 1 merchants, people who are processing millions of credit cards annually, you're looking at potentially a week or 2 weeks or more. Now, it's also important to note that not only is it the hosts and IPs, but it's also the number of perspectives that you have. If you've got 5 zones that are in your CDE, and you've got 50 zones that are outside your CDE, and each of those 50 zones have unique exposures into the CDE, then that's a lot of juggling that needs to be done to make sure that we're testing from each of those zones effectively. So the complexity of the network, the complexity of the number of services will play on that. In general, those day estimates I think are fairly accurate.
Great. And we'll continue on to make sure we can get through the rest of the presentation and continue to address questions at the end. Again, if you have questions that are more particular to your organization, we will reach out to you on an individual basis, and that way we can hopefully give you a more accurate answer when it comes to things like how long things would take, how much things could cost, etc. Go ahead, Chad.
Okay. So moving on, let's talk about network penetration testing best practices. So shopping for a pen test, there are 4 main things that I would recommend we talk about for shopping for a network pen test. Automated versus manual, this is where we're going to answer that question. Comprehensive versus targeted, evaluating pen test providers, and then evaluating deliverables. So automated is always going to be cheaper, typically cheaper. There are some very rare exceptions, but automated is faster and manual will yield more accurate results. If I had to summarize it in 3 bullet points, that's how I would do it. I apologize for anyone who participated in our previous webinars, but I'm actually going to repeat a story that I told on a previous one just because it applies to network pen testing as it does to everything else. Before I share this story, let me emphasize that there is no standard, industry-wide accepted standard for how penetration tests are to be performed. So between vendors, you'll get different interpretations and different implementations of a penetration test. But within this last year, I was actually asked by a bank rep who came to talk to us about some potential services. He asked, what defines a manual penetration test? Does pushing a button manually to launch an automated tool define a manual penetration test? This is a common argument that we see among many pen testing firms. I personally respond that it doesn't, and I'll go into details why on this next slide. So manual penetration tests have the ability to identify key elements of a penetration test that automated tools have limited capability to. Automated tools being one of them. Identifying false positives being one of them. But more importantly, identifying interference from security appliances. We did a penetration test a year ago against an organization that had regular scan penetration tests from another vendor. And those scans came back with 0 ports open, and one of them came back with a single web server open, and it was always a clean report. While it showed the port open, it didn't show any data about the port, services that were listening, what type of software it was running, anything about it. When we went and tried to perform our assessment, we saw similar behavior, except our manual analyst flagged it and said, that's not correct. I know there's a web server there. So he actually went in, dove in, and found out that it was their firewall had been configured to block port scanning. And so when port scans would stop, it would automatically respond with all closed ports on everything. The automated tool only solution was not able to identify that and ultimately led to a false sense of security for the organization. While our manual assessment or a manual pen test was able to quickly identify that within the matter of 30 minutes or an hour and be able to move towards how do we fix this, how do we accurately assess the environment, and then providing the value that the customer was ultimately after. There are other things like the ability to assess non-standard protocols or services. I kind of mentioned this. General purpose VA scanners are targeting the most common or frequent software out there on the internet. But with the prevalence of GitHub and other open source projects, or even just small organizations in general, there are a lot of non-standard protocols and services out there. And these general purpose VA scanners can't effectively evaluate the security of them. That requires a manual perspective into it, manual time spent with the vendor or with the manual, the documentation, to look for issues associated with that protocol or that service. Other things that are kind of obvious, they can't translate risk from generic CVSS scores to organizational risk, or even that they just can't provide customer-specific remediation recommendations. Automated scans are sort of one-dimensional. While there has been some interesting work towards introducing AI on some advanced scanning engines, or introducing subsequent scanners, so it's a series of automated tools based on different conditions that exist in the environment, I personally adhere towards a purist view, which is you need a manual analyst there. The industry isn't mature enough to have an automated tool only, is my perspective on that. So hopefully that answers your question about the difference between a manual pen test and an automated. From the PCI realm, there is no clear definition inside of the inside of the DSS itself that says it has to be manual, except for the fact that it says it has to use industry standard methodologies. And I'm not familiar with any industry standard methodologies like the NIST 115 that they mention that include that it can be automated only. In the supplement, as we mentioned, that we were a part of, that was one of the first topics we discussed as a group, and one of the first things that we wrote into that document, which is the difference between the two. And in the supplement, it does recommend and require a manual penetration test to be performed. So hopefully that answers the questions associated with that. If not, feel free to send in more. So comprehensive versus targeted. The most accurate assessment of a security environment can only be obtained while performing a comprehensive test. Earlier, I was asked the question of, is it more valuable to perform pen tests more frequently than annually? This is what I'd follow up on that, which is test more of your exposures, test more of your environment, step out of the PCI-centric perspective and start testing your other servers. At the end of the day, it's not just cardholder data that we need to protect. We need to protect our organization's reputation. We've seen organizations that have simply been defaced, and the hacker leaves their trademark on where their homepage used to be. Or we've seen situations with the most recent malware that's been released, WannaCry, where it's not just about the sensitivity of data, it's about the availability of data, and it's about the integrity of the data that you house. And that's not just limited to cardholder data, or for HIPAA, personal identifiable information. There is other information that you're interested in protecting. So when you're looking for a pen test provider, these are the guidelines I typically give. This aligns very close to what's in the supplement, but you really want us to evaluate what questions did they ask about your environment. Earlier they asked about, the audience asked about how long a network pen test takes to perform. Well, it's associated with the complexity of the environment and the number of services exposed. If an organization that's quoting you for an assessment doesn't ask you any questions associated with those 2 points, then what confidence do you have that they have sufficient time or capability to perform your assessment? What type of experience do they have that will help them with your environment? If you've asked someone to come and pen test your IBM mainframe, well, there's not a lot of pen testers that I'm aware of that have familiarity with old IBM mainframes and would be able to effectively pen test that. So you want to pick out someone who has speciality or experience doing that in the past. Certifications are not foolproof. Don't be fooled by people who just have a long list of alphabet soup behind their signature. It really is about what those certifications provide. We get a lot of applicants to be a pen tester here at SecurityMetrics who have more certifications than I have letters in my name, and yet when we ask them to apply their skills that they've learned in those certifications, they're unable to do so. They're unable to translate theory into application. And so from my perspective, certifications can be beneficial, but they are not the end-all, solve-all. How long has the analyst been performing pen tests? Do you want someone who's relatively new in the industry, or do you want a seasoned vet targeting your environment? And last but not least, what experience does the organization have with your security standard? If they're not a PCI shop and you're trying to get a PCI pen test that your QSA will accept, make sure that you're talking to your QSA and saying, will you accept this report, their deliverable, or do they meet what you're expecting, your criteria for the penetration test. You can definitely use internal resources. For PCI, there are 2 requirements, and I think this applies to all organizations, regardless of if you're in PCI or not. Are they organizationally separate from the environment? Pen testing your own stuff is really difficult because you have a list of assumptions in your head about the environment. You built it, you configured it. While that can provide you an advantage, it also provides some blind spots that analysts aren't often aware of. And so they need to be organizationally separate from what they're assessing. In this situation, I wouldn't want someone the system administrator that built the environment, to do a network pen test against the environment. So with that being said, we're going to stop for another quick poll real quick. It should pop up here momentarily on the screen. So we're going to give it about another 10 or 15 seconds, and then we'll go ahead and continue on. Okay, so I kind of mentioned this before, just barely before, which is evaluating the deliverable. Make sure that when you're looking at a pen test provider that you request a sample report. Could your organization take action with the information provided in the report? I've mentioned this a few times during this webinar today. We see it quite frequently in pen test reports that there are security issues listed that the pen tester or the analyst has not included what servers or services are affected by it. It's impossible to take action on that. Some organizations take the viewpoint, well, I want to review my entire environment for where that issue could be prevalent. And that's all right, but your developers and IT administrators are going to have a much harder time, and you're going to have a lot more back and forth with the provider, the pen test provider, than you would if they provided you those in the beginning. And most importantly, if you're doing an audit, whether it be PCI, HIPAA, SOC, whatever audit it may be, make sure that your auditor will approve of the report and they'll accept it at the end. We've had many instances where people have gone for the $500 glorified VA scan, and they've gotten it to their QSA and found out that they wouldn't accept it. That puts you in a bad situation because you're out the $500, but more importantly, you're out the week's worth of preparation time. You now are in a rush to find a provider that can perform it to meet your deadlines. Avoid that time crunch by making sure you're communicating effectively with your QSA or your auditor. So takeaways, again, our main goal, our main objective in providing this webinar series has been to help you understand the basics of penetration tests and to enable you to have more effective conversations with management and pen test providers to allow you to evaluate them and to also sort of pitch to management and get the security budget that you need to effectively do your job. So we're going to stop here real quick and do another round of questions.
Great. Thank you all for the questions. We've received a lot. We're trying to sift through them as quick as possible to address as many as we can, and the ones that kind of cover the most ground and answer as many as possible. Again, we will reach out to you individually if we don't get a chance to get to your questions. So can you review the 2 requirements for using an internal resource for PCI pen tests, as far as like you talked about being organizationally separate? Perfect.
Yeah. So you need to be organizationally separate. That means that if in their job responsibility, they are maintaining, building, designing an environment that needs to be tested, they are not organizationally separate. They're tied to that environment. They have not insider information, but they're familiar with it, and so they should not be performing the assessment. So they need to be organizationally separate. They also need to have the previous slide here. Are they experienced? Do they have any certifications? How long have they performed pen tests? Are they going to be able to effectively evaluate the environment you're asking them to test? While I've got salesmen, in the past we've had salesmen interested in performing pen tests, they haven't had any of these criteria, and so I would never put them on any of our pen tests because ultimately I wouldn't say that they're qualified to perform that. You as the organization need to make that ultimate call of, are they effective? Are they going to be able to effectively evaluate it, and do they meet that criteria?
Perfect. And you talked about some of the less expensive penetration tests, and that oftentimes they are just kind of glorified VA scans. So if someone's looking into a pen test that is cheaper, maybe it's done overseas or maybe it's more automated than manual, what are some of the tips to make sure that it's going to be adequate? And would you recommend, or do most QSAs, to your knowledge, allow using pen testers that are overseas or less expensive?
Yeah, that's one of the hurdles that QSAs have, is how do I accurately assess the effectiveness of a penetration test? Overseas providers can be effective, and we've seen organizations that can. However, there are many providers, I've probably seen more providers overseas that have difficulties. Specifically in specific regions of the world, they have struggled to provide high quality penetration tests consistently. And not to say that they can't, it's just consistently can they. So when it comes time to evaluating overseas providers or providers in general, the questions that I gave you are a great start. In the pen test supplement, there's more questions that we've also included in there. But really what I would recommend doing is evaluating how many hours they're going to provide on the environment. What are they quoting? Are they going to be spending 5 manual hours to assess 1,000 hosts, or compared to your other quotes that came in with 10 or 30 hours to assess the same environment? Sort of get a baseline. That's where getting multiple quotes can help you. But also talk to them and call them out and just say, hey, look, I'm really afraid I'm getting a glorified vulnerability scan, or I'm getting a verified automated scan for my penetration test. What is your guys' perspective on that? What's your perspective on doing a comprehensive pen test? Really engage with that provider and ask them these questions. That's the best tool that I can offer for you, or best strategy for identifying those type of providers.
Great. And before we get to the last few questions that we have time for, just one more reminder, we get the question all throughout the webinar. We will send out the recording and the slide deck for your review, so be watching for that. And hopefully that helps to digest some of the answers or slides that maybe are a little more technical. So Chad, you mentioned some different ransomware, WannaCry. So how would you say pen tests help avoid ransomware, protect against it, and just kind of your overall view of the importance of a penetration test when it comes to protecting against ransomware and other types of attacks?
Great question. So directly, it does not protect against ransomware or some of these other attacks. Ultimately, though, people who have a bad security practice in general, who have consistently, either year after year or across all their environments, have unpatched systems, they're leaving themselves very open to these ransomware attacks, because we all know that many of the low-hanging fruit or the script kiddie ransomwares are exploiting known vulnerabilities that have already been patched. If you have a immature security program where you're leaving unpatched systems, then it's a fairly accurate conclusion that your desktops, your workstations are probably in a similar state. And so that's where a penetration test can give you a holistic view of what your security program really looks like, and you can start to apply that across the board. Other pen tests where you include non-PCI targets, where you're going to target everything within your environment, is going to directly target those workstations. So now it's not just you sort of apply, you sort of induce or conclude based on using inductive reasoning that the other systems are potentially outdated as well, but you'll directly be able to see outdated workstations and be able to call that out as well. For 0 days, there is no protection against that. There's very little protection. That's where it comes down to user training. Social engineering can provide value in that area, though.
Great. And it looks like we're about out of time. I'll ask one last kind of general question, I'll let you speak to it. We got a lot regarding certifications and some trainings. And so what would you say are some recommendations you give as far as certifications to look into, or ways to get experience if people want to be able to become a penetration tester, be the internal resource for their company, etc.?
So look for a certification that has a manual or an application side to it. I would personally recommend staying away or not investing all your time towards theory-based certifications. There is a trend among a lot of them that I've heard that they're at least moving towards application-based, which I'm really excited for because it's long overdue. But certifications like the OSCP, which they have a lab where you're going to have to target it, you're going to have to attack it, you have to compromise X number of servers. That type of practice I think is very effective. Now the OSCP itself, I'm not necessarily saying that is the certification because we've seen OSCP certified analysts that still struggle, but it's a great introduction into the environment, into the industry of pen testing because it allows you to get experience with older servers, known exploits. It gets you familiar with the process that we went through earlier of you have to get this 1,000-foot view. You're going to have to identify what servers are there. You're going to run automated tools and validate the findings. Then you're going to have to go and do your research. You're going to have to go through the manuals. You're going to have to go through a lot of these different websites to try and find vulnerabilities or misconfigurations there so that ultimately you can identify issues and exploit them. So I think that those hands-on certifications is where I would recommend. OSCP is the one that comes to my mind for network pen testing. I know there's other ones out there, but unfortunately, on the spot, that's the only one that's come into my head.
Great. Well, it looks like we're out of time. We went a couple minutes past. Thanks again for everyone's patience today getting up and going and for all the questions that came flooding in. As I mentioned, we will send out the recording and the slide deck as well as some of the other resources and links that Chad has referenced so that you can get more educated. And if you have questions in the future, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll be reaching out in the next few days with individual questions as well as we weren't able to get to all of them. So thanks again for everyone's participation this morning, and we look forward to talking to you again.